My name is Sophia Reyes, and for 12 years, I was forced to call a man dad who wasn't even my real father. Richard Blackwood demanded that title from me every single day, despite knowing that I was fully aware he had no biological connection to me whatsoever. He insisted on the charade not out of love or genuine paternal feeling, but as a way to maintain control over the elaborate deception that had shaped my entire childhood and adolescence. The truth about my real identity didn't emerge until I was 18 years old, when a DNA test I'd secretly ordered revealed that Richard Blackwood was not my father, my supposed mother Linda wasn't my mother, and the entire family structure I'd known my whole life was built on lies, manipulation, and criminal activity that would eventually land multiple adults in federal prison. But the story really begins much earlier, when I was 6 years old and living in what I now know was my fourth different home with my fourth different set of parents. At the time, I had no understanding of the complex criminal network that was moving me from house to house, family to family, as part of an elaborate child trafficking operation disguised as legitimate adoption and foster care placements. Richard and Linda Blackwood had taken me in through what they claimed was an emergency foster placement arrangement. They told neighbors, schools, and anyone who asked that I was Linda's niece whose parents had died in a car accident, and that they were in the process of formally adopting me to provide stability and family connection during a traumatic time in my young life. The story was compelling and generated sympathy from everyone who heard it. Teachers gave me extra attention and support, neighbors brought casseroles and offered to help with childcare, and extended family members embraced me as a new addition to the Blackwood clan. Everyone believed I was a grieving child who had found safety and love with caring relatives who were stepping up during a family crisis. But the reality was far different. Richard and Linda Blackwood were part of a sophisticated child trafficking network that operated across multiple states, moving children through various households for purposes that ranged from illegal labor to more sinister forms of exploitation. I was valuable to them not as a daughter they loved, but as a source of income through government subsidies, tax benefits, and payments from the criminal organization that had placed me with them. Richard was particularly invested in maintaining the father-daughter facade because it provided him with legitimate cover for his other criminal activities. As a supposed family man raising his deceased brother-in-law's child, he appeared to be a stable, responsible member of the community. This image helped him avoid scrutiny from law enforcement while he operated drug distribution networks, money laundering schemes, and the very child trafficking operation that had brought me into his household. From my earliest memories in the Blackwood house, Richard insisted that I call him Dad and refer to Linda as Mom in all situations. This wasn't a gentle suggestion or a gradual transition as I became comfortable with my new family situation. It was a firm requirement that was enforced through punishment, manipulation, and psychological pressure designed to break down my sense of individual identity and replace it with the role they needed me to play. If I slipped and called him Richard or failed to use the parental titles he demanded, the consequences were swift and unpleasant. Richard would use a combination of verbal intimidation, emotional manipulation, and physical punishment to reinforce his expectations. He would tell me that refusing to acknowledge him as my father was disrespectful to my dead parents' memory, that I was being ungrateful for the home and care he was providing, and that my behavior could result in being sent away to much worse living situations. The psychological pressure was even more effective than the direct punishment. Richard was skilled at making me feel guilty, confused, and dependent on his approval for any sense of security or belonging. He would alternate between moments of apparent affection and care with periods of cold rejection and criticism, creating an emotional environment where I never knew what to expect or how to earn consistent acceptance. Linda played a different but equally important role in maintaining the deception. She presented herself as a loving, nurturing mother who was doing her best to help me adjust to our family situation. She would comfort me after Richard's punishment sessions, explain that he was just trying to help me heal from my trauma, and encourage me to try harder to be the daughter that both of them deserved. Her approach was more subtle but perhaps more damaging than Richard's direct intimidation. Linda created an emotional dependency where I craved her approval and affection while simultaneously feeling guilty for the burden I was placing on her supposed sacrifice and generosity. She made me believe that my failure to seamlessly integrate into their family was causing her personal pain and disappointment. The daily reality of living with the Blackwoods was a constant performance where I had to maintain the role of grateful, loving daughter while suppressing any questions about my past, my real identity, or the inconsistencies I noticed in their stories about my supposed family history. I learned to monitor my own behavior constantly, choosing words and actions that would reinforce the family narrative rather than threaten the delicate fiction they had constructed. Every morning began with the same ritual of acknowledging Richard as my father and Linda as my mother, reinforcing the family roles that had been assigned to me rather than chosen. Breakfast conversations were carefully scripted performances where I would express gratitude for their care, enthusiasm for family activities, and appropriate deference to their parental authority. Any deviation from the expected script would result in correction, criticism, or punishment designed to reinforce my compliance. The psychological pressure was constant and exhausting. I had to remember which version of my family history to reference in different situations, which details about my supposed deceased parents were safe to mention, and which questions about my past were forbidden topics that would trigger Richard's anger or Linda's manipulative emotional responses. Simple childhood activities became complex exercises in maintaining deception. When friends visited our house, I had to ensure that they would see evidence of a normal, loving family rather than the controlling, artificial environment that actually existed. When teachers asked about my family background for school projects or parent conferences, I had to provide information that would support the false narrative while avoiding details that might trigger official scrutiny. Even my private thoughts and feelings had to be monitored and controlled. I learned to suppress curiosity about my real origins, to avoid dwelling on the inconsistencies in the Blackwood's explanations, and to focus on being grateful for my current situation rather than questioning how I had come to be in it. This constant self-censorship created a split between my public persona and my inner life that became increasingly difficult to maintain as I grew older. The most painful aspect of this daily performance was the requirement to express love and appreciation for Richard and Linda while knowing instinctively that our relationships were based on manipulation rather than genuine affection. I had to hug Richard when he demanded physical affection, thank Linda for her supposed sacrifices on my behalf, and participate in family traditions that celebrated bonds I knew were false. School became both a refuge and another venue for the performance. Teachers and classmates knew me as Sophia Blackwood, Richard and Linda's adopted daughter who was doing remarkably well considering the trauma she'd experienced. I received extra support and patience from adults who believed I was recovering from the loss of my parents, and I developed friendships with children who accepted the family story without question. But school also provided me with access to information and perspectives that gradually made me question the narrative I'd been given about my own life. As I grew older and my understanding of family dynamics became more sophisticated, I began to notice inconsistencies in the Blackwoods' explanations about my past, my supposed deceased parents, and the circumstances that had brought me to live with them. The first major crack in their story came when I was 10 years old and working on a family tree project for a school assignment. I asked Richard and Linda for information about my biological parents, their names, where they had lived, details about their lives that I could include in my project. Their responses were vague, contradictory, and clearly improvised rather than based on actual knowledge of real people. When I pressed for more specific information, claiming that I needed names and dates for my school project, Richard became angry and defensive. He told me that dwelling on the past was unhealthy, that my real family was the one that was taking care of me now, and that I should focus on being grateful for what I had rather than obsessing over people who were dead and gone. Linda tried to soften Richard's harsh response by explaining that the memories were too painful for them to discuss in detail, and that they were trying to protect me from learning disturbing information about the accident that had killed my parents. She suggested that we could work together to create a family tree that focused on the Blackwood family history instead, emphasizing the family that was actually raising me and providing for my future. Their evasiveness and emotional manipulation around this simple school assignment convinced me that there were secrets about my past that they were deliberately hiding. I began paying closer attention to their conversations, their interactions with other adults, and any information I could gather about how I had come to be part of their household. The investigation I began as a curious 10-year-old evolved over the next 8 years into a systematic effort to uncover the truth about my real identity and the circumstances that had brought me to the Blackwood family. I learned to ask indirect questions, to observe and document inconsistencies in their stories, and to research public records and family history information using school computers and library resources. My research methods became increasingly sophisticated as I gained access to better technology and developed more advanced investigative skills. I learned to use public library computers to search genealogy websites, court records databases, and newspaper archives for information that might shed light on my real origins. I created fake email accounts to contact various government agencies and social service organizations, posing as a student researcher to gather information about adoption procedures and missing child cases. The most challenging aspect of my investigation was maintaining absolute secrecy about my research activities. Richard and Linda monitored my internet usage at home, reviewed my school assignments, and paid close attention to my social interactions and extracurricular activities. Any sign that I was investigating my past or questioning their authority would have resulted in severe consequences and possibly the destruction of evidence I needed to establish my real identity. I developed elaborate systems for concealing my research activities and protecting any evidence I gathered. I used school computers during lunch periods and after-school activities, saved information on flash drives that I hid in various locations, and created coded systems for documenting my findings without creating obvious records that could be discovered by the Blackwoods. The emotional toll of conducting this secret investigation while maintaining the daily performance of being Sophia Blackwood was enormous. I was essentially living two completely separate lives, one as the compliant, grateful daughter that Richard and Linda expected, and another as a detective investigating the criminal deception that had shaped my entire existence. Every piece of evidence I uncovered that contradicted the Blackwood story increased my certainty that I was living with people who had stolen my identity and separated me from my real family. But each discovery also increased the danger of my situation, as I knew that Richard and Linda would go to extreme lengths to protect their secret if they discovered that I had uncovered the truth. The psychological strain of this double life was compounded by the isolation I felt from having no one to share my discoveries with or seek guidance from about how to proceed. I couldn't confide in friends without potentially putting them in danger. I couldn't trust teachers or other adults without knowing whether they might report my concerns to the Blackwoods, and I certainly couldn't confront Richard and Linda directly without risking violent retaliation. By the time I was 14, I had accumulated substantial evidence that the story about my deceased parents and my relationship to Linda was fabricated. Property records showed no evidence of any family connection between Linda and anyone with my supposed original last name. Death certificates for the time period when my parents had allegedly died didn't include anyone matching the descriptions Richard and Linda had provided. More disturbing was what I discovered about Richard and Linda's own backgrounds. Richard had a criminal history that included fraud, drug distribution, and suspicious financial activities that suggested involvement in organized crime. Linda had worked for several different social service agencies and adoption organizations, but her employment history included gaps and irregularities that raised questions about her professional conduct and legal compliance. The pattern that emerged was of two people who had used their access to vulnerable children and dysfunctional families to create opportunities for illegal activity and personal profit. They weren't loving relatives who had stepped up to care for an orphan child, they were criminals who had acquired me through illegal means for purposes that had nothing to do with providing a loving home. This realization was both liberating and terrifying. Understanding that Richard and Linda weren't my real family explained many of the inconsistencies and uncomfortable dynamics I'd experienced throughout my childhood. But it also meant that I had no idea who I really was, where I had come from, or whether I had any real family members who might be searching for me. More immediately, it meant that I was living with criminals who had been deceiving me my entire conscious life and who might pose a serious threat to my safety if they discovered that I had uncovered their secrets. I had to continue playing the role of dutiful daughter while secretly planning to escape their control and discover my real identity. The most challenging aspect of maintaining this deception was the continued requirement to call Richard Dad and treat him with the respect and affection expected of a biological daughter. Every time I said the word, it felt like a betrayal of my true self and a reinforcement of the lies that had controlled my life for over a decade. But I also understood that Richard's insistence on the paternal title was about more than just maintaining our cover story. It was a daily assertion of his power and control over my identity, my relationships, and my understanding of my place in the world. By forcing me to acknowledge him as my father, he was reinforcing the psychological manipulation that kept me dependent on his approval and afraid to challenge his authority. The breakthrough in my investigation came during my senior year of high school, when I was preparing college applications and needed official documentation of my academic and personal history. I requested copies of my birth certificate, social security card, and other official documents, claiming that I needed them for scholarship applications and college enrollment processes. The request was routine and legitimate. Every high school senior needed these documents for college applications, financial aid forms, and scholarship competitions. But Richard and Linda's reaction to my request revealed the depth of their deception and the precarious nature of the false identity they had constructed for me. Richard's initial response was to demand detailed information about why I needed the documents, which specific colleges and organizations had requested them, and whether there were alternative forms of identification that might satisfy the requirements. His questions were probing and suspicious, far beyond the normal parental interest in a teenager's college planning process. When I provided reasonable explanations for needing the documents and insisted that original or certified copies were required rather than photocopies, Richard's demeanor shifted to barely controlled anger. He began making threats about what would happen if I continued to push for documentation that he claimed was unnecessary and potentially problematic for reasons he refused to explain. Linda attempted to manage the situation through her typical approach of emotional manipulation and false concern. She suggested that my insistence on obtaining official documents indicated that I didn't trust my family or appreciate the care they had provided. She made comments about how hurtful it was to have me treating them like strangers or criminals when they had sacrificed so much to give me a stable, loving home. But underneath her emotional appeals, I could see the same anxiety and fear that Richard was displaying. Both of them understood that official documentation would create a paper trail that could expose their criminal activities and potentially lead to the discovery of my real identity. They were desperate to prevent me from obtaining documents that every other teenager acquired routinely for college applications. Richard and Linda's response to this routine request was panicked and evasive in ways that confirmed my suspicions about the illegitimate nature of my placement with them. They claimed that my original documents had been lost in a fire, that replacement documents were difficult to obtain because of bureaucratic complications, and that I should use alternative forms of identification for my college applications. Their excuses were transparently false and contradictory, and their obvious anxiety about providing official documentation convinced me that my legal status was even more complicated than I had realized. I began to suspect that not only was I not their biological daughter, but that my placement with them might not even be legally authorized through legitimate adoption or foster care procedures. Using resources available through my high school guidance counselor, I was able to order an official copy of my birth certificate directly from the State Vital Records Office. The document I received contained information that completely contradicted everything Richard and Linda had told me about my origins and family history. According to my birth certificate, my real name was Isabella Santos. I was born in California rather than Arizona, and my parents were listed as Maria Santos and Carlos Santos, names that bore no resemblance to the family history Richard and Linda had constructed for me. The document also included information about the hospital where I was born and the attending physician, details that would allow me to trace my real origins if I chose to pursue the investigation further. Armed with this official documentation of my real identity, I was able to conduct more targeted research about my actual family background. Using internet search engines, social media platforms, and public records databases, I began looking for information about Maria and Carlos Santos and any connection they might have to my disappearance from their lives. The search results were both heartbreaking and hopeful. I found multiple missing child reports, social media posts, and news articles about Isabella Santos, a 6-year-old girl who had disappeared from her family's home in San Diego 12 years earlier. The investigation into my disappearance had been extensive and ongoing, with my biological parents never stopping their search for information about what had happened to their daughter. The missing child reports included photographs of me as a 6-year-old that were unmistakably accurate, along with detailed descriptions of my physical characteristics, personality traits, and the circumstances surrounding my disappearance. Reading these reports was emotionally overwhelming. I was seeing myself described by people who actually knew and loved me, rather than by criminals who had been using me for their own purposes. Most importantly, the reports indicated that Maria and Carlos Santos were still alive, still searching for their daughter, and still hoping for information that might lead to my recovery. They had never stopped believing that I was alive and that they might someday be reunited with the child who had been taken from them over a decade earlier. This discovery created an urgent dilemma about how to proceed with revealing the truth and connecting with my real family. I knew that confronting Richard and Linda directly about my discoveries would be dangerous and potentially catastrophic. They had invested 12 years in maintaining the deception about my identity, and they had criminal histories that suggested they were capable of extreme measures to protect their interests. I also knew that I needed to approach my biological parents carefully and through appropriate channels to avoid causing them additional trauma or raising false hopes about my identity and circumstances. After 12 years of believing their daughter might be dead, they would need official verification and professional support to process the reality of my survival and recovery. Working with my high school guidance counselor, who is bound by confidentiality requirements and trained to handle sensitive family situations, I developed a plan to contact law enforcement and child welfare authorities about my situation. The plan involved gathering comprehensive evidence of the deception, documenting the criminal activity I had observed in the Blackwood household, and providing officials with the information they would need to verify my identity and safely extract me from the illegal situation. The guidance counselor, Mrs. Jennifer Walsh, had 20 years of experience working with students from complicated family backgrounds, and she immediately understood the seriousness and complexity of my situation. She helped me compile my evidence into a comprehensive report that included documentation of my real identity, evidence of the Blackwoods' deception, and information about their criminal activities that went far beyond my own case. Mrs. Walsh also connected me with Detective Carlos Mendoza, a specialist in child trafficking and family crimes who had experience investigating cases involving long-term deception and identity fraud. Detective Mendoza reviewed my evidence and confirmed that my situation appeared to be part of a larger criminal network that had been under investigation by federal authorities for several years. The investigation that followed revealed that Richard and Linda Blackwood were indeed part of a sophisticated child trafficking operation that had been moving children across state lines for over 15 years. I was one of dozens of children who had been placed in various households for purposes ranging from illegal labor to sexual exploitation to the collection of government benefits and tax fraud. The network operated by creating false identities for stolen or abandoned children, then placing them with criminal associates who would use the children for various forms of exploitation while maintaining the appearance of legitimate family relationships. The children were moved frequently to prevent them from developing stable attachments or accumulating enough knowledge about their situations to expose the operation. My placement with the Blackwoods had been relatively benign compared to some of the other situations investigators discovered, but it was still a serious crime that had deprived me of my real family and identity for 12 years. Richard and Linda had benefited financially from government subsidies, tax benefits, and direct payments from the trafficking network, while also using my presence in their household to provide cover for their other criminal activities. The day of Richard and Linda's arrest was both terrifying and liberating. Federal agents surrounded the house early in the morning while I was getting ready for school, and within minutes the entire deception that had controlled my life for 12 years was finally exposed. Richard's reaction to being confronted with evidence of his crimes was violent and threatening, confirming that my instincts about the danger of confronting him directly had been correct. Linda's response was different but equally revealing. She claimed that she had genuinely cared for me and that her maternal feelings were real even if our relationship had begun through illegal means. She seemed to believe that her emotional attachment to me should somehow excuse or mitigate the criminality of what she had done to my real family and me. But both of their reactions reinforced how completely they had been manipulating me throughout my childhood. Richard's anger was focused not on the harm he had caused to me or my biological family, but on the inconvenience and legal consequences he was facing as a result of being caught. Linda's claims of maternal love were undermined by her willingness to participate in separating me from my real parents and maintaining lies about my identity for over a decade. The reunion with my biological parents took place 3 weeks after the Blackwoods' arrest, in a carefully controlled environment with professional counselors and social workers present to help all of us process the emotional complexity of the situation. Maria and Carlos Santos had aged visibly during the 12 years they had spent searching for their daughter, but their joy at my recovery was immediate and overwhelming. The weeks leading up to our reunion had been filled with careful preparation by social workers, therapists, and law enforcement officials who understood the delicate nature of family reunification after such an extended separation. Both my biological parents and I needed extensive counseling to prepare for the emotional impact of reconnecting after 12 years of believing we might never see each other again. Maria and Carlos had never stopped hoping for my return, but they had also tried to protect themselves emotionally from the possibility that I might never be found or that I might not survive whatever circumstances had led to my disappearance. They had created memorial spaces in their home where they kept photographs, toys, and clothing from my childhood, but they had also tried to build lives that could continue even if I was never recovered. During the years of my absence, they had become advocates for other families dealing with missing children, working with law enforcement agencies and victim support organizations to improve systems for investigating disappearances and supporting affected families. Their advocacy work had helped them channel their grief and determination into activities that might prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. The reunion itself was both wonderful and awkward, filled with tears, embraces, and the strange experience of trying to bridge a 12-year gap in our relationships. I was no longer the 6-year-old Isabella they remembered, and they were no longer the young parents I had known in my earliest childhood. We all had to learn how to connect as the people we had become rather than trying to recreate the relationships we had lost. My parents brought photo albums spanning my entire childhood, showing me the bedroom they had maintained exactly as I had left it, the birthday parties they had celebrated in my absence, and the family gatherings where my empty chair had served as a constant reminder of their loss. They had never stopped including me in their lives, even when they didn't know where I was or whether I was alive. The most emotional moment came when my father, Carlos, asked me to call him Dad, not as a demand or requirement, but as a request from someone who had never stopped loving his daughter. The contrast with Richard's forceful insistence on the same title was profound and healing. This was a man asking to reclaim his rightful relationship with his child, not a criminal demanding acknowledgement of false authority. The reunion was both wonderful and difficult. My parents had never stopped loving me or hoping for my return, but I was no longer the 6-year-old child they had lost. I was an 18-year-old young woman who had been shaped by 12 years of deception, manipulation, and psychological control. We all had to learn how to build a relationship based on our current realities rather than our memories and hopes. The most challenging aspect of reconnecting with my real family was overcoming the psychological conditioning that had been imposed by 12 years of being forced to call Richard Dad and accept his authority as a parent. Even after understanding the truth about my identity and the criminality of my situation, I struggled with feelings of guilt and confusion about rejecting the parental relationship that had been central to my understanding of myself. Recovery required extensive therapy to help me process the trauma of my childhood deception and develop a healthy sense of identity independent of the roles I had been forced to play. I worked with specialists in child trafficking recovery who understood the complex psychological effects of long-term identity deception and family separation. Dr. Rebecca Chen, my primary therapist, specialized in helping victims of long-term psychological manipulation and identity fraud recover their authentic sense of self. She explained that my situation was particularly complex because the deception had begun when I was very young and had continued through my entire developmental period. Unlike adults who experience identity theft or deception, I had never had the opportunity to develop a stable sense of who I was independent of the false narrative imposed by the Blackwoods. The therapy process involved slowly dismantling the psychological conditioning that had controlled my thoughts, emotions, and behavior for 12 years while simultaneously helping me discover and develop my authentic personality and preferences. This was challenging because I had become so skilled at suppressing my natural responses and presenting the personality that Richard and Linda expected that I sometimes struggled to identify what I actually felt or wanted. Dr. Chen used various therapeutic techniques to help me recognize and overcome the psychological manipulation I had experienced. We worked on identifying the specific techniques the Blackwoods had used to control my behavior, understanding how these techniques had affected my emotional development, and developing new patterns of thinking and responding that were based on my own values and preferences rather than fear of punishment or rejection. One of the most important aspects of therapy was learning to trust my own instincts and perceptions rather than constantly second-guessing myself or seeking approval from authority figures. 12 years of having my observations dismissed, my questions discouraged, and my instincts contradicted had created deep patterns of self-doubt and external validation seeking that had to be carefully addressed and overcome. The process of rebuilding my relationship with my biological parents also required professional support and guidance. Family therapy sessions helped all of us understand the impact of our shared trauma, develop realistic expectations for our rebuilding relationship, and create new patterns of communication and connection that acknowledged both our shared history and our current realities. My parents had their own recovery work to do, processing the grief and trauma of losing their child, the anger about the crimes that had been committed against our family, and the complex emotions surrounding my return. They had to learn how to parent an 18-year-old daughter they barely knew while respecting the independence and maturity I had developed during my years of separation from them. One of the most important realizations in therapy was understanding that my instinctive discomfort with calling Richard Dad had been my subconscious mind's way of maintaining connection to my true identity even when I had no conscious access to memories of my real family. My resistance to fully accepting the Blackwood family narrative had been a form of psychological self-protection that ultimately enabled my recovery. The legal proceedings against Richard, Linda, and their criminal associates continued for over 2 years and resulted in federal convictions for child trafficking, kidnapping, fraud, and organized crime activities. Richard was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison, while Linda received a 20-year sentence in recognition of her cooperation with investigators and her role in helping to locate other victims of the trafficking network. The investigation also led to the recovery of 8 other children who had been placed in similar situations, some of whom had been separated from their families for even longer periods than I had been. My decision to investigate my own situation and report the crimes had created a breakthrough that helped law enforcement dismantle an entire criminal network and reunite multiple families. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was the opportunity to rebuild my relationship with my real parents and discover my authentic identity as Isabella Santos rather than the fictional Sophia Blackwood. Learning about my actual family history, cultural background, and the circumstances of my early childhood helped me understand aspects of my personality and preferences that had never made sense within the context of the fabricated family narrative. My parents had been devastated by my disappearance but had used their grief and determination to become advocates for other families facing similar tragedies. They had worked with law enforcement agencies, child welfare organizations, and victim advocacy groups to improve systems for investigating child disappearances and supporting affected families. Their advocacy work provided a foundation for my own involvement in efforts to combat child trafficking and support recovery for other victims of family deception and identity fraud. My experience navigating the psychological challenges of recovering from long-term deception gave me unique insights that could help other survivors and their families. College became an opportunity to study criminal justice and victim advocacy while also experiencing normal young adult development that had been impossible under the controlling environment of the Blackwood household. For the first time in my life, I was able to make decisions based on my own interests and values rather than the need to maintain a deceptive performance for criminal manipulators. The transition to authentic family relationships was gradual and sometimes difficult, but ultimately transformative. Learning to call Maria and Carlos mom and dad felt natural and healing in ways that using those titles with Richard and Linda never had. The difference was that my relationship with my real parents was based on genuine love, shared history, and mutual respect rather than manipulation, deception, and control. Today, 5 years after my recovery, I work as a victim advocate specializing in cases involving child trafficking and family deception. My experience has given me unique credibility with other survivors and valuable insights into the psychological techniques used by traffickers to maintain control over their victims. The name Sophia Blackwood still appears on some of my older documents, but it no longer represents my identity or my understanding of who I am. Isabella Santos is my real name, and Maria and Carlos Santos are my real parents, relationships that were temporarily stolen from me but ultimately couldn't be permanently destroyed by criminals who wanted to use me for their own purposes. The 12 years I spent being forced to call Richard Blackwood Dad were 12 years of my life stolen by people who cared nothing about my welfare or my right to know my own identity. But those years also taught me about resilience, the importance of trusting my instincts, and the power of truth to ultimately overcome even sophisticated deception. Every time I call my real father Dad now, it's a choice made from love rather than an obligation imposed through manipulation. The difference is profound and healing, and it reminds me daily that authentic relationships are worth fighting for, even when the fight takes years to win. My name is Isabella Santos, and I am finally, truly, and completely my real father's daughter.